Hey, thanks for coming over. I've been diving into this paper by Marc Trachtenberg about NATO and the U.S. back in 1990, and man, it's a lot to untangle.
Oh, I know the one. It's that huge debate over whether the U.S. actually promised Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't move an inch to the east, right?
Exactly. I mean, Secretary of State James Baker literally used those words in February 1990, not 1 inch to the east. It sounds so definitive.
It does, doesn't it? But then you look at what happened later, and the Russians are basically saying, hey, you guys totally reneged on a promise.
Right. Gorbachev even said in 2008 that it showed the West simply can't be trusted because half of Central and Eastern Europe is in NATO now.
But here's the thing. The official U.S. line, especially from Baker himself later on, was that they were only ever talking about East Germany, the GDR.
That feels like a bit of a stretch, though. Trachtenberg points out that other officials like Robert Gates actually felt Gorbachev was led to believe expansion wouldn't happen anywhere.
Exactly. And look at Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister at the time. In his Tutzing speech in January 1990, he was way more explicit.
Oh, let me find that. Yeah, he said, whatever happens to the Warsaw Pact, NATO wouldn't expand closer to the Soviet borders. That sounds like he's talking about more than just Germany.
He totally was. There's even a transcript from a press conference on February 3rd where Genscher says it applies to all the other Eastern countries, and Baker was standing right next to him.
No way! So Baker was right there while Genscher told the world this was a general assurance for the whole East?
Pretty much. Trachtenberg argues that since the State Department didn't issue a clarification, it's reasonable to think Baker was on board with that broader interpretation at the time.
But why do so many scholars like Mark Kramer call this a myth then? They seem so sure no such pledge was made.
Well, their main argument is that NATO expansion beyond Germany wasn't even a thing yet. They say nobody was even thinking about the Warsaw Pact collapsing in early 1990.
But is that true? I saw a note here about a Washington Post article from February 4th saying the Warsaw Pact was already dead in Eastern Europe.
Exactly. By then, the Soviets had already agreed to pull troops out of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The CIA was even reporting in late '89 that these countries might leave the pact.
So the idea that nobody was thinking about it doesn't really hold water. People were clearly seeing the vacuum coming.
Definitely. In fact, internal U.S. memos from the NSC were already talking about a strong U.S. presence in Eastern Europe as early as January 1990.
Wait, so while they were giving these no expansion assurances to the Soviets, they were already planning how to fill the power vacuum?
It looks that way. Robert Zoellick even recalled anticipating the possibility of Poland and others joining NATO right around that same time.
That's wild. It makes the whole "it was only about East Germany" excuse look like a convenient pivot after the fact.
Right, and Trachtenberg points out that even if Eastern Europe wasn't the main topic of the meetings, the assurances were given to assuage the security concerns of the Soviets.
Which only makes sense if you're talking about the whole region, not just one piece of Germany.
But because it was never put into a formal signed treaty, people like Mary Surratt say it wasn't a binding promise, even if the Russians were totally justified in feeling misled.
So it's like a technicality versus the spirit of the deal. The U.S. got what they wanted, German reunification in NATO, and the Soviets got, well, vague oral assurances.
And that's why the debate is still so heated 30 years later. It's about whether the post-Cold War world was built on a misunderstood handshake.
It's crazy how much those few days in February 1990 still shape everything today. I'm definitely going to have to reread those Baker-Gorbachev transcripts.
They're fascinating. It's like watching a high-stakes poker game where one side thinks they're playing for the whole table and the other thinks it's just for the next hand.
All right, so let's talk about the big NATO promise. It's like the ultimate he said, she said of international politics, right? Did the West actually promise Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't move east?
It's a total mess. Historians like Mary Surratt and Christina Spohr have been digging through the archives, and there's no easy answer. Spohr's take is basically, if it's not on paper with a signature, it didn't happen.
Wait, so she thinks because there's no written treaty barring expansion, the assurances weren't binding at all? That feels a bit legalistic, doesn't it?
It definitely is. Surratt is a bit more nuanced. She thinks it was a giant misunderstanding. The Soviets thought a verbal gentleman's agreement was solid, but the Americans were like, if there's no ink, we're not committed to anything.
That sounds like a classic power move. Oh, you didn't get that in writing? Too bad.
Exactly. And she even says Gorbachev had a window in February 1990 to strike a real deal, but he missed it. He didn't get the guarantee in writing, and as she puts it, the window closed.
But come on, does international diplomacy really work like a used car sale? If the U.S. Secretary of State gives you assurances, isn't that politically binding?
That's the argument. I mean, if high-level officials could just walk away from everything they say because it's not a formal treaty, diplomacy would just collapse. You have to be able to trust what's said in the room.
Oh, that's a great point. And wasn't there something about Berlin, too?
Yeah, in 1945, Roosevelt didn't push for a written guarantee for Western access to Berlin because he didn't want to signal a lack of trust to the Soviets. It was a verbal agreement between commanders that the U.S. was willing to go to war to defend.
Wow, so Gorbachev was kind of following the Roosevelt model of mutual trust, which obviously didn't work out as well for him.
Not exactly. The author breaks it down into 3 factors for how binding a verbal promise is: how explicit it is, if it's part of a deal, and the general context.
Okay, so how explicit was the NATO thing? Was it just vague, we'll be friends talk?
Actually, it was surprisingly clear. At a press conference in February, the German foreign minister, Genscher, with Secretary Baker right there, said they were in full agreement that NATO defense wouldn't extend east, not just for East Germany, but for all the other eastern countries.
Wait, he said all the other Eastern countries? That's not vague at all.
Right? He told the Soviets it was a firm principle. So on factor 1, explicitness, it ranks pretty high.
But what about the deal part? Was this a we won't expand if you let Germany reunite situation?
That's the controversial bit. Baker suggested that if the Soviets let a unified Germany stay in NATO, then NATO wouldn't move east. But the author says the connection was a bit tenuous. It wasn't a clean one-for-one swap.
So it wasn't a formal quid pro quo. What about the context? Was this just a one-off comment?
No, it was a cascade of assurances. Bush, Baker, Major, Mitterrand, they were all telling the Soviets they sought no unilateral advantage and would respect Soviet security interests.
So it was a whole vibe, a web of assurances, like the author says.
Exactly. Even if there wasn't one single deal, the Soviets made huge concessions, like letting Germany stay in NATO within this atmosphere of promised cooperation.
So did we lie? Did the West just tell them what they wanted to hear to get Germany back?
Some people think so. Vladimir Putin certainly does. And historian Joshua Shifrinson argues the U.S. was insincere, basically creating a cooperative facade while planning to dominate Europe.
That's dark. Is there proof for that?
Well, Bush did tell Cole in private, "We are going to win the game, but we must be clever while we are doing it." He also said, "We prevailed, they didn't."
Oof, we prevailed. That doesn't sound like a partnership of equals.
No, and by July 1990, Baker was already talking about Eastern Europe joining NATO. Yet. That one word changed everything.
Wait, yet? So the not 1 inch promise lasted, what, 5 months?
Pretty much. Once they got what they wanted, Germany and NATO, the pressure to jolly the Russians along just disappeared.
But was it just about power, or was there a real security reason to expand?
The author suggests a more stable motive. U.S. officials believed they had to stand between Germany and Russia to prevent a security dilemma. Like, if the U.S. wasn't there, Germany might feel the need to get its own nukes to protect itself from Russia.
So NATO expansion was actually meant to reassure both sides? Like keeping Germany contained so Russia didn't have to worry?
That was the pitch Baker gave Gorbachev. He said a neutral Germany might become militaristic or nuclear, but a NATO-contained Germany was safe for everyone. And Gorbachev actually said that sounded realistic.
It's wild how Gorbachev himself flip-flops on this now. One year he says he was hoodwinked, the next he says the promise only applied to East Germany.
Yeah, he's been under a lot of fire in Russia for being naive. Admitting he was promised something that wasn't written down makes him look bad, so he might be trying to rewrite his own history.
Man, it's messy. It feels like the West was technically right because nothing was signed, but morally, they definitely shifted the goalposts.
Exactly. Whether it was a deliberate lie from day one or just a policy that evolved once the Soviets got weak, it's easy to see why it's still such a massive point of contention today.
Okay, so I was looking into this whole debate about NATO expansion, and honestly, it feels like one big he said, she said from the 90s. Did the U.S. actually promise Russia they wouldn't move east?
It's the million-dollar question, right? And the short answer is yes, they basically did. In February 1990, Secretary of State James Baker and the German Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, gave these very clear assurances to the Soviets.
Wait, so it wasn't just some vague we'll be friends talk. They actually said no expansion?
Exactly. The record shows that Baker had the entire Warsaw Pact area in mind, not just East Germany. It was this idea that if the Soviets let Germany reunite, NATO wouldn't move an inch further.
But then we did, like almost immediately after. What changed?
Do we just flat out lie to Gorbachev?
Well, the author argues it wasn't necessarily a deliberate lie right at that moment. It was more like, as 1990 went on, U.S. leaders realized the Soviet Union was way weaker than they thought. They saw they could basically do whatever they wanted without a real fight.
So it was a power move, like we made a deal when you were strong, but now you're weak, so the deal's off.
In a way, yeah. By mid-1990, those February assurances weren't seen as binding anymore. Gorbachev later called it sweet talk, and Russia still resents it to this day.
I mean, I get why they'd be mad, but I've heard people say it doesn't count because it wasn't a signed treaty. Is that how international law actually works?
That's a huge point of contention. Most legal scholars actually say verbal commitments from a foreign minister can be legally binding. There was this famous case in 1933 where the World Court ruled that a verbal promise about Greenland was binding.
No way. So James Baker's words could have actually had the force of law.
Potentially, but in international politics, it's often more about power than a courtroom. The U.S. basically decided that the moral obligation to protect the new democracies in Eastern Europe outweighed the promise they made to a crumbling Soviet Union.
Hold on. Truman said that? That sounds so cynical.
Right? They just wanted what they called an open sphere. The Soviets could have their security interests, but the countries in Eastern Europe would have internal autonomy, sort of like how Finland operated. They even called the goal the Finlandization of Eastern Europe.
Finlandization. I've heard that term. So basically, you guys stay neutral and don't join our enemies, and we won't mess with your government.
Exactly. Even in 1961, Kennedy told Khrushchev that the U.S. didn't want to deprive the Soviets of their ties in Eastern Europe. They were trying to be realistic about the balance of power.
It's funny how realistic changes once you realize you're the only superpower left standing.
Totally. But there's another layer to why the U.S. stayed in Europe that has nothing to do with the Soviets. Have you heard of double containment?
Double containment? Like containing two things at once? Who else were we containing?
Germany.
Wait, what? We were containing our own ally?
Yeah, there's this famous quote by Lord Ismay that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down.
Keep the Germans down. Wow, that's blunt. I thought we were all friends by the 60s.
We were, but there was this deep-seated fear that if the U.S. left, Germany might go nuclear or become an independent wildcard again. Even Joe Biden, back when he was a senator in 1997, said NATO's job was to harness Germany, just as much as it was to contain Russia.
That is wild. So NATO was basically a security blanket for everyone around Germany, too.
Absolutely. It was about creating a stable system where Germany was so integrated into the West, economically, militarily, culturally, that they'd never want to strike out on their own.
It's like a keep your friends close situation. But how did Gorbachev feel about that? Did he buy into the NATO keeps Germany safe argument?
He actually did concede at the May 1990 Washington summit that a reunified Germany could choose its own alliance. The U.S. saw that as a huge breakthrough.
So he did agree to Germany being in NATO? That sounds like he gave away the farm.
For Germany, yes. But the catch, and this is what Russia still argues, is that he didn't think that meant the rest of the Warsaw Pact would join NATO too. He thought he was agreeing to one thing while the U.S. was already moving the goalposts.
It's like a classic contract dispute, only with nuclear weapons. The author mentions a comparison to 1918?
Yeah, the 1918 armistice. Germany felt the Allies were negged on the promises of the Wilsonian peace program. That resentment fueled the instability that led to World War II. The author is basically warning that walking away from assurances, even if they aren't official treaties, can have a massive long-term price.
Man, that is heavy. It's not just about who was right in a legal sense. It's about the legacy of that trust being broken.
Precisely. History doesn't just stay in the past. It's the springboard for how these countries deal with each other today. And Russia is still jumping off that 1990 springboard.
Okay, I was just reading about the end of World War I, and I think I've been looking at it all wrong. It's like the Germans were basically promised one thing to stop fighting, but then the deal completely changed.
Yeah, that's the pre-armistice agreement of 1918. It's actually a pretty huge deal that people skip over. It wasn't just a random surrender. There were very specific terms.
Right, because Woodrow Wilson had those 14 points, and that's what the Germans thought they were signing up for, right?
Exactly. Wilson sent a note on November 5th, 1918, basically telling them, look, the peace will be based on my 14 points and my other wartime speeches. There were only two big exceptions.
Only two? That seems like a pretty solid guarantee for a country that's losing a war.
You'd think so, but one of those exceptions was a massive loophole. It said Germany had to compensate for all damage done to the civilian population and their property by land, sea, and air.
Wait, that actually sounds reasonable, though. Like, if you invade a country and destroy houses, you pay for them.
On paper, yeah. But the way they interpreted civilian damage later on, that's where things got messy.
Before we get to that, was this actually a legal contract? Did the Germans sign a document saying, we agree to this note?
Actually, no. It was technically a unilateral offer. The Germans didn't even send a note back formally accepting it.
No way. So how did it become binding?
Well, they just showed up. By sending military reps to meet the Allied commander to arrange the armistice, that was taken as acceptance, and both sides treated it as a binding promise afterward.
Okay, so they have this gentleman's agreement based on civilian damage. Then they get to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and what happened?
Then the British showed up with a massive bill. They basically wanted Germany to pay for the entire cost of the war.
But that wasn't in the deal. The deal was for civilian property damage.
Right? Their logic was wild. They argued that since taxpayers pay for the war, and taxpayers are civilians, then the cost of the war is technically civilian damage.
That is the biggest stretch I've ever heard. Did the Americans buy that?
Luckily, no. The American team fought back and said, no, the agreement was way narrower than that. So the war costs idea got scrapped.
Okay, so the Americans held the line?
Briefly, but then the British shifted tactics. They said, okay, fine, no war costs, but what about military pensions?
Pensions? Like for soldiers? That is definitely not civilian damage.
Exactly. Wilson's own advisors told him it was the same bad logic they just rejected for war costs. It made no sense.
So did Wilson fold?
This is the best part. When his advisors pointed out the lack of logic, Wilson apparently snapped. He yelled, "Logic, logic. I don't give a damn for logic. I am going to include pensions."
No way. He actually said that? I don't give a damn for logic?
Yep, he just wanted it done. And the crazy thing is, even the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, knew deep down that pensions shouldn't be included based on the agreement.
So they both knew they were breaking the promise they made to get the Germans to stop fighting.
Pretty much. They pushed for it anyway, and it basically doubled the reparations bill for Germany.
Man, I can see why the Germans would be furious. You surrender thinking the terms are fixed, and then they just invent new categories of debt.
Exactly, and scholars point to this as a huge reason for the disaster that followed in the interwar period. The Germans felt the Treaty of Versailles had zero moral validity.
Right. It's hard to respect a treaty when you feel like the foundation of it was a bait and switch.
Totally. In their eyes, the Allies hadn't honored the agreement, so why should they? They felt completely justified in trying to overthrow the whole settlement.
It's like they were looking for a reason to feel victimized, and the Allies just handed it to them on a silver platter.
Yeah, it really undermines the whole peace part of the peace conference when the very first step is breaking a promise.
Okay, so I was looking into this Gail Lapidus piece on Chechnya, and the whole setup of the Soviet Union was just a total legal fiction, wasn't it?
Totally. It was a federation of sovereign republics on paper, but in reality, it was as centralized as it gets, until Gorbachev came along and actually tried to liberalize things.
Right, and then once he opened that door, everyone just rushed for the exit. But what's wild is how the 15 main republics got recognized as independent states almost overnight, while places like Chechnya were left in this weird limbo.
Exactly. Lapidus points out that while the big breakup was mostly peaceful, it triggered these deadly regional wars in places that wanted that same sovereignty but weren't union republics.
And Chechnya was the big one. I mean, the numbers in here are staggering. We're talking up to 100,000 people killed, and the capital city, Grozny, just completely leveled.
It's horrific. And the piece argues this wasn't some inevitable tragedy. It says the war was deliberately launched by the Russian leadership during a power struggle over Chechnya's status.
Wait, so it wasn't even a last resort like they claimed?
Not according to Lapidus. The research shows the decision to use force wasn't made after all peaceful options were gone. It was much more about elite politics in Moscow and Grozny.
That's insane. But you have to look at the history, right? The Chechens have been resisting Russian expansion since like the 1700s. It's not like this tension just appeared in 1991.
Right. They were the symbol of resistance in Russian literature, like in Tolstoy. But the real trauma, the one that still defines their elite today, was 1944.
Oh, is that when Stalin deported the entire population?
Yeah, 500,000 people packed into trains and sent to Central Asia because of these fake claims that they were collaborating with Nazis. A third of the population died.
A third? I can't even imagine that kind of collective trauma. No wonder they wanted out as soon as the USSR started shaking.
Exactly. And then you have the parade of sovereignties in the 90s. Yeltsin is actually the one who told the local elites to take all the sovereignty you can swallow when he was fighting Gorbachev for power.
Wait, he actually said that? Talk about a backfire.
Seriously, he was trying to undermine the Soviet center, but then he ended up as the leader of a Russia that was starting to fray at the edges itself.
So then you get Jokhar Dudayev. This guy was a Soviet general, right? How does he end up leading the Chechen independence movement?
He was serving in Estonia and saw their independence movement firsthand. When he got back to Chechnya, he used that playbook to consolidate power and eventually declared de facto secession.
But the weird thing is, Lapidus says this didn't start as a massive grassroots ethnic conflict. It was mostly just a few guys at the top in Moscow and Grozny not getting along.
Right. It was a failure of policymaking. Moscow didn't have a clear federal structure, and the decision-making was just, well, it was a mess. Very personalized and ad hoc.
And what about the military? I read that there were people warning that a surgical strike wouldn't work, but they did it anyway?
Exactly. There was no real coordination. Yeltsin's inner circle convinced him he could just roll in and restore constitutional order quickly.
And the international community just let it happen?
That's the troubling part. Western governments basically treated it as an internal affair of a sovereign state. They prioritized their relationship with Yeltsin over stopping the violence.
Even when Grozny was being targeted and civilians were being destroyed, that's a huge failure of preventative diplomacy.
Totally. Lapidus argues that by the time the West got loud about it, it was already a political embarrassment, but they didn't apply any real pressure early on to force a negotiation.
So you have this quasi-state situation where Chechnya has control, but no one recognizes them. It's like this frozen conflict that's just waiting to explode again.
Precisely. The political systems in both Moscow and Grozny were too weak and too focused on internal rivals to actually reach a durable peace.
It's just wild how the legacy of Soviet paper sovereignty created such a real, bloody mess 60 years later.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how administrative borders that were meant to be symbolic can become very, very real when a centralized power collapses.
Okay, so I was looking into this whole breakdown of the conflict in Chechnya, and it's way more complicated than I thought. It's not just one war. It's like this 6-stage slow-motion train wreck.
Totally. It's wild how it went from 1991, where it could have been handled differently, to a full-scale catastrophe. The first stage was basically an abortive military intervention right when the USSR was collapsing.
Right. Yeltsin tried to declare a state of emergency in November 91, but then he immediately had to reverse it. Moscow's troops were at the Grozny airport and just left.
Yeah, they withdrew almost as soon as they arrived. But the author points out that this actually backfired because it just made the Chechen leader Dudayev look stronger and consolidated his support.
Wait, so then for like 2 years, Moscow basically ignored them? The text calls it benign but profitable neglect. That sounds shady.
Oh, it was incredibly shady. While hardliners in Moscow were calling the Chechen government a criminal regime, other Russian officials were literally doing business with them.
Doing business? That what?
We're talking trafficking in oil, weapons, and drugs. There were even unregulated international flights coming in and out of Grozny for money laundering. Both sides' criminal groups were making a killing.
That's insane. So Moscow's elite were profiting off the very instability they were complaining about.
Exactly. But by 1994, the political wind shifted. Yeltsin's reformist advisors were out, and a hawkish coalition moved in. They stopped the neglect and started trying to covertly overthrow Dudayev.
And they actually tried to assassinate him with a car bomb. I read that it missed him because he wasn't in his usual spot in the motorcade.
Yeah, a remote control bomb in May 94. When that failed, they started secretly arming the Chechen opposition and even recruited Russian officers for a covert operation.
But that turned into a total fiasco. That armored march on Grozny in November 94? Man, what a mess.
It was humiliating. The Russian-backed forces were routed, and the Chechen government paraded captured Russian soldiers on live TV. And the Russian defense minister, Grachev, tried to deny they were even his troops.
I bet that didn't go over well. Did that make him back off?
Nope, it did the opposite. The humiliation pushed Yeltsin and the Security Council to go from covert to overt. They wanted a small but victorious war to boost Yeltsin's popularity.
They thought it would be a bloodless blitzkrieg that would last a week. A week? How wrong can you be?
Seriously, instead of a week, it turned into 2 years of brutal warfare. The casualty numbers the author gives are staggering. 100,000 people killed and nearly 400,000 refugees.
And the Russian public wasn't even behind it. Like 60% opposed the use of force. It sounds like the military was just destroying the very place they claimed was part of their own country.
That's the irony the material points out.
To prove Chechnya was part of Russia, they treated it like a foreign enemy. It was a surgical strike that turned into a massacre.
So how did they finally get to the peace table? It sounds like stage 5 was just a long, bloody stalemate.
Well, the Chechen militants used some really desperate tactics, like hostage-taking, to force negotiations. And then Dudayev was killed by a Russian rocket in April 1996, which actually stalled things for a bit.
Oh, right. But then General Lebed comes in. He seems like the key player here.
He was. Lebed had no responsibility for starting the war, so he could admit it was wrong and unwinnable. He negotiated the Khasavyurt Agreement in August 96 after the rebels retook Grozny.
Wait, the rebels actually retook the capital? That must have been a huge embarrassment for the Russian military.
It was the final nail in the coffin. Lebed realized that constitutional order couldn't be built with airstrikes. He actually respected the Chechen leaders as negotiating partners.
So the peace deal basically kicked the can down the road, right? They deferred the decision on Chechenya's status for 5 years.
Yeah, it was a deliberate ambiguity that let both sides claim a win. But looking back, the author argues this whole thing was a series of missed opportunities.
Totally. Like, the Russian government claimed force was a last resort, but they never even had high-level bilateral talks before invading. Yeltsin wouldn't even meet with Dudayev.
Exactly. They demonized him instead. Dudayev even reportedly ordered a new suit because he was so sure a meeting with Yeltsin would happen. But the hardliners blocked it every time.
It's crazy how much of this comes down to just a few people in a room making really bad assumptions about a quick victory.
And ignoring all the tools they had, third-party mediators, the UN, the OSCE, Moscow just kept saying it was an internal affair until it was too late.
Okay, so I was diving into this paper about the Chechen conflict in the 90s, and it's honestly a bit haunting how much the international community just missed the warning signs.
Right. It's framed as this massive failure of preventative diplomacy. By 1994, it was so clear that things were about to explode between Moscow and Grozny, but the West just kind of looked the other way.
Wait, but why? I mean, the text says there was ample warning as early as 1991. It wasn't like a surprise overnight thing.
Part of it was just how obscure the region was. There was no real Western expertise or media focus. And unlike, say, Nagorno-Karabakh, there wasn't a huge diaspora in the West pushing for attention.
So because there wasn't a vocal group at home, politicians just figured it wouldn't affect regional security since it wasn't an interstate war.
Exactly. They framed it as an internal issue. Meanwhile, NGOs like the UNPO were literally screaming that an invasion was coming, but they were dismissed as just supporting any minority group that asked.
It's like the experts were saying, oh, they're just being dramatic. But the Russian media was actually being super frank about it, right?
Actually, yeah. Russian investigative reporters were exposing the fact that the government was secretly recruiting soldiers for operations in Chechnya and sending in heavy weapons long before the official invasion.
See, that's wild. So the info was out there. Why did Western analysts minimize the likelihood of a real war?
Well, Yeltsin and his aides kept giving these public and private assurances that they'd resolve it peacefully. Yeltsin even said on TV that a forced intervention would be impermissible because the whole Caucasus would rise up.
And the West just believed him? Or they wanted to believe him?
A bit of both. The U.S. was preoccupied with NATO expansion and Bosnia. They didn't want Chechnya to derail the broad parameters of the U.S.-Russia partnership.
And Moscow was also doing a major PR job on how they described the situation, right? Putting it in terms of crime and order?
Oh, definitely. They portrayed Dudayev's government as nothing but a criminal conspiracy. They used a lot of ethnic stereotyping, basically treating all Chechens like criminals to justify restoring order.
Which I guess makes it easier for a foreign government to stay out of it. Like, oh, they're just cleaning up a crime-ridden province.
Precisely. Even when the invasion actually happened on December 11th, Clinton's first reaction was to call it an internal affair and hope for minimum bloodshed.
Wait, didn't Secretary of State Warren Christopher go even further?
He did. He basically said it's best to leave it to Yeltsin's judgment. He's a Democrat. He knows what he's doing. It was almost an endorsement.
That is so surreal looking back. But the most bizarre part of the paper was the comparison to the American Civil War. Did they really go there?
They really did. Foreign Minister Kozyrev used it on Meet the Press. He basically compared Yeltsin to Abraham Lincoln, saying no leader can tolerate a part of their country defecting.
Comparing Lincoln to Yeltsin in the mid-90s that's a choice, especially given the actual conduct of the war.
Right. It totally sidestepped the human rights violations. The U.S. was so worried about Russia's nuclear stability that they essentially gave Moscow a de facto license to ignore international law.
But then the reality on the ground started hitting the news. The surgical strike turned into a bloodbath.
Yeah, once the indiscriminate shelling of civilians started and the Russian military's disarray became obvious, the tone in Europe shifted. People were like, wait, this isn't a quick police action.
So the EU actually started to push back.
Eventually, they delayed a partnership agreement because they were so indignant about political problems being solved with tanks. But by then, preventive diplomacy was long dead.
It's just crazy how much was sacrificed for the sake of pragmatic partnership.
Totally. They underestimated the Chechens' determination to fight and overestimated the Russian military's competence, all while ignoring the blatant warning signs for years.
So I was looking into how the OSCE handled the whole Chechnya situation in the mid-90s, and honestly, it sounds like they were walking on eggshells the entire time.
Oh, absolutely. They had the clearest mandate for preventative diplomacy, but Russia was basically like, stay out of our business. This is an internal matter.
Right, and the member states didn't even want to push for a human rights fact-finding mission because they didn't want to tick off Moscow.
Exactly. I mean, look at Laszlo Kovacs, the Hungarian foreign minister. He sent a representative just to ask if they could send a tiny team of experts. It was that delicate.
Wait, so they actually got a team in there by January 1995?
They did, but it was super restricted. They couldn't even mention human rights violations in their mandate. They had to stick to expressing deep concern.
That's wild. And then they set up that permanent presence in Grozny, but they couldn't even call it a mission, right?
Yeah, they called it an assistance group. Calling it a mission would have implied Russia was doing something wrong, which Moscow wouldn't stand for. Russian sensitivity was through the roof.
But I read that the EU actually played a big part in getting that group established. They basically held a trade agreement over Russia's head.
Totally. They insisted on an OSCE presence as a condition for the interim trade deal. It was one of the few times they actually used real leverage.
So even with all those constraints, did the OSCE actually accomplish anything?
Surprisingly, yeah. Under Tim Goldeman, they actually built trust with moderates on both sides. They weren't just watching. They were brokering direct negotiations and facilitating prisoner exchanges.
That's actually impressive. But what about the rest of the world? It feels like everyone else was just kind of watching from the sidelines.
Well, the Council of Europe froze Russia's admission, but big institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, they just kept the money flowing.
Wait, they didn't cut off the loans? I thought people were accusing them of basically financing the war.
Oh, they were, but the West was terrified that if Yeltsin fell, some ultranationalist or communist would take over. They prioritized Yeltsin's survival over everything else.
It's that classic devil you know situation. Plus, they needed Russia's help with NATO enlargement and Bosnia.
Right. Chechnya was seen as marginal compared to nuclear dismantlement and European security frameworks. It's a brutal calculation.
But then you have the UN. I saw that the Secretary General basically said, sorry, our hands are tied by the Charter.
Yeah, citing Article 2.7 about domestic jurisdiction. But it's funny how that norm of sovereignty only seems to be that rigid when a major power is involved.
Exactly. If it's a smaller state, suddenly international organizations are all over their internal affairs.
Totally. And there was this huge fear of the domino effect. Moscow played up the idea that if Chechnya left, the whole Russian Federation would fall apart.
Which the West just bought into.
Pretty much. They valued stability and existing borders more than the principle of self-determination in that case.
It's crazy that Yeltsin later admitted the war was his biggest disappointment. He even said he agreed with Western criticism that force could have been avoided.
Yeah, but that was in October 1995, after the damage was done. The material notes that the West failed to even try to head off the conflict early on.
So after all that, they get to 1997 and sign this peace treaty. It sounds like it promised the world, but did it actually change anything?
On paper, they renounced force forever, but Chechnya thought they had de facto independence, while Moscow insisted they were still part of Russia.
So it was just a stalemate, and now it's this quasi-state where nobody recognizes them?
Exactly. And inside Chechnya, things got really bleak. The economy was destroyed, and with the West basically walking away, the leadership started turning toward Islamic law for social order.
Wait, Maskadov actually said that the first constitution was secular just to please the West, but since that didn't get them support, they went a different way?
Precisely. It shows how much international reaction, or lack of it, shapes these local movements. Now it's just a frozen, unstable mess.
It's wild how the idea of sovereignty is so powerful that it can just trap a region in this limbo for years.
Yeah, and the international system really only sees two options. You're either a state or you're not. There's no middle ground for these ambiguous situations.
So I was digging into this paper by Joel Hellman about post-communist transitions, and honestly, it kind of flipped everything I thought I knew about economic reform on its head.
It's a classic for a reason. Most people start with this idea called the J-curve, right? The idea that things have to get worse before they get better.
Right, like you're traversing a valley of transition to get to the higher hills. You expect high unemployment and price hikes while the economy adjusts.
Exactly. And the logic used to be that you need to insulate the government from the losers, the workers and pensioners who are hurting, so they don't vote the reformers out before the benefits kick in.
But that's the thing. Hellman says that in these post-communist countries, that's not actually what happened. The countries with the most frequent elections and shortest government tenures were actually the most radical reformers.
It's wild, right? You'd think a prime minister who's worried about losing their job in 6 months would play it safe. But Poland had like 7 prime ministers in 7 years and still pushed through massive changes.
Wait, hold on. If it wasn't the short-term losers blocking reform, then who was it? Because some countries really stalled out.
This is the core of Hellman's argument. He calls them the winners of partial reform. We're talking enterprise insiders, commercial bankers, even local officials who basically hit the jackpot early on.
So wait, the people who liked the first bit of reform are the ones stopping the rest of it?
Precisely. They love the partial reform equilibrium. Think about a banker who benefits from distorted financial markets, or a manager stripping assets from a state firm they now own.
Oh, so if the reform actually finished and the market became fully competitive, those easy profits, those rents, as the paper calls them, would vanish.
Right. They don't want a full reversal to communism, but they definitely don't want a fair, transparent market either. They want to stay right in that sweet spot where they can exploit the distortions.
That is so counterintuitive. We always talk about creating a constituency of winners to support reform, but Hellman is saying these winners are actually the biggest obstacle.
Yeah, he literally says the challenge isn't insulating the state from the losers, it's restraining the winners.
I was looking at the data in the paper too. The advanced reformers, the ones who went all in, actually had lower output declines than the ones who tried to go slow.
Right. The intermediate reformers actually suffered the most. It's like they stayed in the valley of the J-curve way longer because the winners were keeping them there.
So the slow and steady approach actually caused more pain. It's kind of a gut punch for the gradualist argument.
Totally. And get this, Hellman talks about a winner's curve, which is like the inverse of the J-curve. The winners see their incomes skyrocket at the start because of these distortions.
And then, as the reform progresses and the market gets more efficient, their special gains start to drop because they have to actually compete.
Exactly. So they have every incentive to veto any further progress. They use their concentrated wealth to lobby or, let's just say influence the political process.
It's a collective action problem, but in reverse. Usually we think the losers are the ones who are organized, but here it's a small, rich group of winners versus the rest of society.
And because their gains are so concentrated, they have much more selective incentive to fight for the status quo than the general public has to fight for a public good like low inflation.
Man, this really changes how you look at political stability. We usually think stable government equals good for reform, but the paper shows that the most stable leaders were often the ones doing the least reform.
Yeah, look at Belarus or Ukraine in that period. Same leaders for years, but they were basically presiding over these partial reform systems that benefited a tiny elite while everyone else suffered.
It's almost like the fear of losing an election forced the radical reformers to actually deliver results to the broader public, rather than just catering to a few big insiders.
That's a huge takeaway. Being vulnerable to voters might actually be a feature, not a bug, if it prevents the winners from capturing the state.
I'm still stuck on the mafiosi part. The paper mentions them as winners who undermine a stable legal foundation.
Oh, definitely. If you thrive in a world of might makes right and shadow contracts, why would you want a functioning, independent court system? That's just bad for business.
So, in a weird way, the winners are more dangerous to the long-term health of the country than the people who lost their jobs.
In the post-communist context, absolutely. It's the politics of partial reform, where the peak of transition is actually the most dangerous point.
The peak of transition. I like that. It's where the winners want to freeze time and just keep the rents flowing.
Right. And if you don't have the political institutions to push past that peak, you just end up in this low-growth, high-inequality trap.
Okay, so I was digging into this paper by Joe Hellman about post-communist transitions, and honestly, it completely flipped how I think about economic reform.
Oh, the winners take all paper? It's a classic for a reason. Most people assume the losers of reform are the ones who try to stop it, right? Like the workers who lose their jobs.
Exactly. I thought it was always about the public getting angry and voting the reformers out. But Hellman argues it's actually the winners who are the biggest obstacle.
Right? It sounds backwards. but he's looking at these partial reforms. Imagine a country starts privatizing things and liberalizing prices, but they don't bother setting up a real legal system or competition policy.
Wait, so they do the fun part of capitalism, but skip the rules?
Basically. And what happens is you get this group of winners, like bankers or state managers turned private owners, who get incredibly rich because the system is so broken and distorted.
So they actually want it to stay broken because that's how they're making their money?
Exactly. Hellman calls it a partial reform equilibrium. These winners have a huge incentive to block further reforms that would actually make the market fair, because fairness would kill their rents, their easy profits.
That is wild. And he actually has data on this, right? He looked at the variance in reform across different areas?
Yeah, he uses these EBRD ratings for things like privatization, banking reform, and price liberalization. If a country has high variance, meaning they're doing great in some areas but lagging way behind in others, that's his measure for partial reform.
And the results were pretty grim for those intermediate reformers, weren't they? The ones stuck in the middle?
Oh, absolutely. They saw the highest levels of inequality. There's this measure called the Gini coefficient. It's the standard for inequality, and it just skyrocketed in places like Russia.
Wait, didn't he say Russia's inequality basically doubled? That's insane for such a short period of time.
It's virtually unprecedented in the post-war era. We're talking about countries moving from very low inequality to being more unequal than most OECD countries in just 5 to 7 years.
And it's not like the whole economy was growing either. The paper says these intermediate reformers actually had worse GDP drops than the countries that went all in on reform.
Right. The advanced reformers had much lower GDP losses. So the countries that did the most reform actually suffered the least in the long run. The ones who hesitated got the worst of both worlds, high inequality and a crashing economy.
It's like, if you're going to jump across a canyon, you don't want to jump halfway.
Precisely. But the people who manage to build a little bridge halfway across and are charging everyone a toll, they don't want the full bridge finished.
So if these winners have all this power, how do you actually break the cycle? Is the answer just less democracy so the state can force reforms through?
Actually, Hellman says the opposite, and this is the part that really surprised me. He found a strong positive correlation between political rights, like democracy, and economic reform.
Wait, really? But wouldn't the losers use their vote to stop the reform?
That's the old theory, but Hellman argues that more inclusive political systems actually restrain the winners. If you have competitive elections and broad coalition governments, it's harder for one narrow group of winners to capture the state.
Oh, I see. So if the losers, the general public, have a seat at the table, they can push back against the oligarchs and the bankers who are trying to keep the system rigged.
Exactly. Inclusion dissipates those private gains. It makes it harder for the winners to veto reforms that would benefit everyone but hurt their specific bottom line.
It's such a different way of looking at it. Instead of insulating the government from the people, you need to use the people to check the elites.
Right. It's about shifting the balance of power. He even looked at the size of coalition governments and found that the bigger the coalition, the more comprehensive the reforms tended to be.
Because more parties mean more eyes on the prize. Like, you can't just bribe one guy if you have 5 different parties in the cabinet.
Exactly. More actors whose agreement is needed makes it harder for the winners to capture the government exclusively.
This really changes the whole J-curve model people talk about in economics, doesn't it?
Totally. The J-curve assumes short-term pain for everyone, followed by long-term gain. But Hellman shows that in these transitions, you often have short-term, highly concentrated gains for a few, while the costs are dispersed among everyone else.
Man, that explains so much about why some of these countries got stuck for so long. The winners were just too comfortable in the mess.
Comfortable in the mess is a perfect way to put it. They became the biggest obstacle to the very market they were supposedly part of.
All right, so I was diving into this paper about the Malta summit in 1989, and man, the atmosphere sounds intense. It wasn't just a meeting, it was like the world was shifting under their feet.
Totally. Think about it. It's December 1989. The Berlin Wall had just come down 3 weeks earlier. Communist regimes were literally falling apart across Eastern Europe, while Bush and Gorbachev are sitting on ships off the coast of Malta.
And it wasn't even a calm meeting. They called it Stormy Seas for a reason. There's so much debate about whether this was a missed opportunity or the moment that actually ended the Cold War.
Right. You've got these different schools of thought. Some say it built this genuine mutual respect. Others call it a missed chance because Bush was too cautious. And a third group says it was just a catalyst that didn't achieve anything concrete on paper.
Wait, but this author argues something totally different. They found a new transcript, right? One that was buried in the Bush Library for years?
Exactly. The American transcript was classified for decades. Everyone was relying on the Russian version. But in 2011, the author piecemealed it together from Condoleezza Rice's files. It changes the whole vibe of the summit.
So it wasn't just two world leaders bonding over coffee. The author says it was more like jostling for position, like they were playing a high-stakes game of poker while the map of Europe was being redrawn.
Precisely. It's a bargaining lens. The transcripts show they weren't just building trust. They were trying to figure out what the other side's bottom line was, especially on the big one, German reunification.
I noticed a weird discrepancy in the transcripts. In the Soviet version, they talk about Western values like it's a philosophy debate, but the American version makes it sound way more strategic.
Oh, it's fascinating. Gorbachev was actually annoyed by the phrase Western values. In the U.S. transcript, Bush tries to smooth it over by saying, "Look, I'm not trying to complicate things. I'm just saying your reforms and our values overlap."
But Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, lets the cat out of the bag, doesn't he? He mentions people are saying the USSR is changing because of Western strength.
Yes, and that's edited out of the Soviet copy. It shows the Soviets were terrified of looking weak. They didn't want the world to think they were surrendering just because their economy was tanking.
No way! They actually scrubbed that? That makes Gorbachev look much more vulnerable than the official Soviet record let on.
Totally. In the Soviet version, Gorbachev sounds like he's driving the bus. In the American transcript, he comes off as impetuous, throwing out radical ideas, while Bush plays the calm, cautious partner.
That brings up that international relations theory the author mentions, the whole rising versus declining power thing. It makes so much sense why Bush was playing defense.
Exactly. Realism 101. If you're the rising power, the U.S. in this case, you want to keep your options open. Time is on your side. Why sign a deal today when you'll be even stronger tomorrow?
And Gorbachev is the declining power. He's the one who needs to lock in a deal quickly before his leverage disappears completely. He's playing offense because he has to.
Spot on. He needed American backing for his reforms just to survive. Bush, on the other hand, could afford to wait and see if the Soviet Union was going to collapse or stabilize.
Wait, let's talk about Germany. This part blew my mind. There's this 6-day gap where everyone wonders why Bush didn't support Helmut Kohl's plan for reunification immediately.
Right. Kohl announced his 10-point plan on November 28th. Bush had plenty of chances to back him, but he waited until December 3rd, the last night of the Malta summit.
People thought it was because Bush was emotional or needed to talk to allies, but the author says it was actually about Malta. He was waiting to look Gorbachev in the eye.
He was testing the waters. He needed to know, if the U.S. pushes for a united Germany, are the Soviets going to send in the tanks? Are they going to crack down like they did in the past?
And Gorbachev basically signaled that he wouldn't. He waxed rhapsodic about states choosing their own futures, which was code for, we aren't going to intervene.
Exactly. Once Bush realized the Soviets were too weak or unwilling to stop it, the uncertainty vanished. That's why he walked straight from the summit to a dinner with Kohl and said, "Okay, we're backing you unequivocally."
So Malta wasn't just a nice chat. It was the green light for German reunification. That's a massive shift in how we look at that meeting.
It really is. It turns the summit from a symbolic event into a concrete foundation for the end of the Cold War. It was about defining the new distribution of power.
It's wild that a transcript being missing for 20 years could hide that strategic layer. It makes Bush look way more calculated than just cautious.
Right? He wasn't just being slow, he was being a statesman. He was letting the Soviet position crumble a bit more to ensure the U.S. got the best possible deal for the future of Europe.
The bargaining lens really changes everything. It wasn't a missed opportunity for a deal. It was a successful probe to see how much the U.S. could actually get.
Exactly. It was the start of a hard bargaining process that lasted for years. Malta was just the moment where both sides finally showed their hands.
Okay, so I was just reading about the Malta summit in 1989, and it sounds like a total movie plot. Two world leaders meeting on ships in the middle of a literal storm, while the Soviet Union is basically falling apart.
Right? It's called the C6 summit for a reason. But what's fascinating is that for 25 years, we only really had part of the story. Now that these American archives are open, we're seeing it wasn't just a friendly chat. It was a high-stakes poker game.
Wait, so it wasn't just about building trust like the history books usually say. I thought Bush and Gorbachev were just getting to know each other.
Well, Bush definitely said there was a friendly openness afterward, but the documents show the U.S. was actually incredibly nervous. They were trying to figure out if Gorbachev was going to send in the tanks.
Wait, send in the tanks where? Like to stop the Berlin Wall from coming down?
Exactly. Think about it. The wall had just fallen a few weeks before. The Soviets still had about 390,000 troops sitting in East Germany.
That's a lot of firepower if they decided to use it.
390,000? I had no idea it was that many. So Bush is on this ship trying to what, just ask him nicely not to use them?
Sort of, but more like testing the waters. The author, Joshua Shifrinson, argues that Malta was actually about reducing uncertainty. Bush needed to know if Gorbachev would accept peaceful change in Eastern Europe without a violent crackdown.
And if he didn't? I mean, what was the U.S. plan if Gorbachev said, actually, no, we're keeping East Germany?
That's where it gets interesting. The U.S. was basically playing for time. They wanted to allow the people in places like Poland and Hungary to do their own thing, which they knew would naturally undercut Soviet influence.
So it was like a slow-motion strategic takeover? But they're telling Gorbachev, we're not trying to take advantage of you.
Precisely. Bush specifically told his team, we will not try to negotiate the future of Europe at the summit. But then he'd turn around and tell Gorbachev that the people there must be allowed to determine their own futures.
Which is basically a polite way of saying they're leaving your side. Did Gorbachev see through that?
He wasn't dumb. He knew the situation was slipping, but he was also desperate for American economic support and for the U.S. not to dance on the wall, which was Bush's famous phrase for not gloating.
Right, I remember that. People actually criticized Bush for being too boring about the wall coming down. But you're saying it was a strategy?
Totally. If Bush starts celebrating in the streets of Berlin, it makes Gorbachev look weak at home. If Gorbachev looks weak, the hardliners in Moscow might overthrow him and send those 390,000 troops into action.
Wow, so it was this delicate dance. And meanwhile, they're both getting seasick on these cruisers?
Yeah, the weather was so bad they had to cancel some of the meetings. But when they did talk, they were arguing about everything from chemical weapons to the German question.
The German question. That was the big one, right? Whether East and West Germany would become one country again?
Yeah, and that's where the new documents really shine. Chancellor Helmut Kohl in West Germany had just dropped this 10-point plan for reunification without even telling the U.S. first.
Wait, really? He just went rogue?
Kind of. The U.S. was actually pretty annoyed at first, but then they realized Kohl's plan kept a united Germany in NATO, which was the U.S.'s ultimate goal.
Okay, so Bush goes to Malta to see if Gorbachev will swallow that pill. Did he?
Not at first. Gorbachev was like, there are two German states. That's just history. Let history decide. He was trying to buy time too.
So no one was really being honest? It's just two guys stalling?
I think it was more about bargaining amid exceptional circumstances. Shifrinson points out that they were both trying to lock in a deal while they still had some power left.
It's crazy that it's taken 25 years to get the American side of these transcripts. Why was it secret for so long?
A lot of it is just the standard declassification process, but these documents are sensitive. They show the internal memos, like Secretary of State James Baker warning Bush not to tie American hands while things were still shifting.
So Baker was the one saying, hey, let's not get too cozy here.
Exactly. He wanted to make sure they didn't accidentally bless a Soviet crackdown by promising too much cooperation.
It's such a mess. And the author even says we need to look at the original Russian documents to be sure about who said what. Are the translations that different?
They can be. There are discrepancies between the U.S. and Soviet versions of the transcripts, like where certain topics, like chemical weapons, actually came up in the conversation.
That's wild. It's like they weren't even in the same room or on the same ship.
Well, when you're in a Force 8 gale and the world order is collapsing, I guess it's hard to keep perfect notes.
Seriously. So the big takeaway is that Malta wasn't just a photo op. It was the moment Bush realized Gorbachev probably wouldn't fight for Eastern Europe.
Right. It was the green light Bush needed to fully back German reunification and push for the end of the Cold War on Western terms.
Okay, so I was diving into this famous X article from 1947, and man, it's like a psychological profile of an entire country.
Right? It's George Kennan basically trying to get inside the head of the Soviet leadership. He's saying their behavior is this weird mix of Marxist ideology and the actual reality of how they stayed in power.
It's wild because he describes these early Bolsheviks as people who were just completely frustrated and hopeless under the Tsar. They didn't have popular support, so they latched onto Marxism as a kind of pseudo-scientific justification for being impatient and wanting revenge.
Totally. It gave them a reason to feel like they were right, even when no one else agreed. But the catch is, once they actually got power in 1917, they didn't really have a plan for running a country. They were a tiny minority, and they were terrified.
Wait, so that's why they went full dictator mode immediately? Because they felt like they'd be swallowed up otherwise?
Exactly. They had no tradition of compromise. From their perspective, any rival power, even just a group of peasants or a local trade union, was a threat that had to be crushed. They wanted everything else to be an amorphous mass, while only the party had structure.
That's actually terrifying. It's like they were building a machine where the only thing that mattered was the master's voice from the top.
And here's the kicker. To keep that machine running, they had to invent an enemy. Once they destroyed all the capitalists inside Russia, they couldn't justify the secret police anymore. So they started shouting about capitalist encirclement from the outside.
So the whole West is trying to destroy us thing, was it just a PR move for their own people?
Mostly, yeah. Kennan argues that the menace from outside is often a fiction used to explain away why life is so hard inside. The Soviet system needs to be in a state of siege to function. Without the enemy at the gates, the whole structure becomes superfluous.
That explains why they're so difficult to deal with in diplomacy. He says they assume the West is inherently antagonistic, so even if they sign a treaty, it's just a tactical maneuver.
Right. It's caveat emptor, buyer beware. You can't appeal to common goals because they don't believe we have any. But Kennan makes this really interesting point. They aren't in a hurry.
Oh, like the toy automobile analogy he uses.
Yes, he says the Soviet machine moves like a wind-up toy car. It heads in one direction and only stops when it hits an unanswerable force. If they hit a wall, they don't panic. They just wait and look for a different crack to fill.
So they're patient, but they're also surprisingly rational when they face real strength.
Exactly. They'll retreat if they have to. They're much more sensitive to contrary force than someone like Hitler was. That's why Kennan came up with the whole idea of containment.
Wait, so containment isn't about being a tough guy and shouting?
No, he actually says that blustering and toughness can backfire because it hurts their prestige. The goal is just to be a steady, firm counterpressure at every point where they try to expand.
It sounds like a duel that never ends. But Kennan thinks they have some serious weak spots, right? Like he mentions the population is just exhausted.
They are spiritually tired. Decades of forced labor and war left people skeptical. Plus, he points out their economy is totally lopsided. They've got heavy industry, but no highways, and their maintenance is a disaster.
And then there's the Stalin problem. He wrote this when Stalin was still in charge, but he was already worried about what happens when a dictator like that dies.
Yeah, the transfer of power. It took Stalin 12 years to consolidate his own rule after Lenin. Kennan's basically saying if the party ever loses its iron unity, the whole thing could collapse overnight because there's nothing else underneath it.
He uses that beautiful metaphor from Thomas Mann, the Buddenbrooks thing, a star that looks like it's shining brightly to us, but in reality it's already dead and we're just seeing the afterglow.
It's such a haunting image. He's suggesting the Soviet Union might already have the seeds of its own decay growing inside it, even while it looks powerful to the outside world.
So the whole strategy of containment was basically just waiting for those seeds to sprout?
Pretty much. Just hold the line, stay cool, and let their own internal contradictions do the work. It's a long-game perspective that really changed how the U.S. saw the world.
So I was reading through this George Kennan piece again, you know, the famous X article from the late 40s, and it's actually wild how he describes Soviet power.
Oh, it's a classic. But it's not just dry policy stuff. He gets really poetic about it, right?
Exactly. Like that part where he talks about the Buddenbrooks novel, he compares the Soviet Union to a star that's actually already dead, but looks incredibly bright to us because the light is still traveling.
Yeah, the afterglow of a constellation on the wane. It's such a gutsy thing to say in 1947 when they looked like this massive, unstoppable force.
Right? He basically argues they have the seeds of their own decay inside them. Like they can hold on to power, sure, but passing it on, that's where the rot starts showing.
And that's why he's so adamant that we can't be intimate with them. There's no version of this where we're partners.
Wait, so he really thought coexistence was just impossible?
At least not a permanent happy coexistence. He saw them as a rival, period. To him, the Kremlin's whole vibe was just constant, cautious pressure to weaken everyone else.
So that's where the whole containment thing comes from. Just meeting that pressure with, what did he call it, unalterable counterforce?
Exactly. Everywhere they try to encroach on a stable world, you hit them with counterforce. But, and this is the part people forget, he didn't think we were just stuck playing defense.
Oh, really? I always thought containment was just, holding the line.
No, he says we can actually influence what happens inside Russia by how we act at home. It's almost like a psychological game.
Like, if we look like we have our act together, they lose heart?
Basically, he says if the U.S. shows spiritual vitality and handles its own problems, the communist goals start to look sterile and quixotic.
Quixotic? Man, he really had a way with words. But he's saying our internal health is literally a weapon of foreign policy.
Totally. He mentions how the ravens of the Red Square were just waiting for the U.S. to hit an economic depression after the war. When it didn't happen, it messed with their whole philosophy.
Wait, that's such a good point. So if we're messy and divided, they get a thrill of hope?
Precisely. He says every time we show indecision or disunity, it gives them a new jauntiness in their step. It literally fuels their pressure on the rest of the world.
That's a lot of pressure on domestic politics. I mean, he's basically saying our own internal bickering is a gift to the Kremlin.
It is, but he also thought that if we stayed firm, the Soviet system would eventually have to mellow or just break up.
Mellow? That sounds optimistic for a guy writing about a messianic movement.
Well, he argues that no movement can face frustration indefinitely without adjusting to reality. Logic eventually has to kick in.
So the whole thing, the entire Cold War, was basically a test of the overall worth of the United States?
That's exactly how he ends it. He says to avoid destruction, we just have to measure up to our own best traditions.
It's kind of wild. He actually says we should be grateful for the challenge.
Yeah, he thanks Providence for giving the American people this implacable challenge.
It's like he's saying we needed an enemy to force us to pull ourselves together.
In a way, yeah. He saw it as history demanding that we take on moral and political leadership. Not because we wanted to, but because we had to.
It makes you wonder what he'd think of things today, if that spiritual vitality he talked about is still there.
Right. If we're still giving the ravens something to worry about, or if we're just feeding that jauntiness in their step.
Okay, so I was looking into this research on the Kosovo conflict, and it's kind of...
Oh, the 1999 NATO campaign? That is basically the origin story for how Russia views the West today.
Right. It's wild because the paper calls it a watershed moment. Like before that, was there actually a chance for them to get along?
There was hope, maybe, but Kosovo shattered it. Russia saw NATO acting without the UN, hitting a sovereign state just to change its internal behavior. It looked like a total disregard for international law to them.
And they felt totally sidelined, right? Because they were going through that massive 1998 financial crisis at the same time.
Exactly. The ruble had collapsed, and they were literally asking the IMF for money while NATO was bombing their traditional ally, Serbia. Talk about a power imbalance.
So they're basically broke and being lectured by the same people dropping bombs in their strategic backyard. That's brutal.
Exactly. One author even said Russia was reduced to a supplicant, just scrambling for cash while being patronized. It really fueled this sense of vulnerability.
Wait, and then NATO expands right before the bombing starts? I didn't realize the timing was that tight.
12 days. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO 12 days before the airstrikes. To Moscow, it looked like they were being systematically excluded from Europe.
No wonder the political elite there flipped. The paper mentions westernizers losing out to status.
Totally. The guys who wanted to play nice with the West were basically laughed out of the room. The new crowd prioritized power, stability, and sovereignty over everything else.
Which leads right into the Putin era. I mean, he became PM just a few months after this, right?
August 1999, and his whole mantra was equal partnership. He basically said, we'll work with you, but only if you respect our interests.
But NATO's argument was that they had to intervene for humanitarian reasons. Did the Russians just not buy that at all?
They saw it as a fig leaf. They thought the West was just using humanitarian intervention as an excuse to weaken rivals and create managed chaos.
And then things got even messier with Chechnya. I remember there was a huge row about that.
Oh, it was the ultimate double standard for Moscow. The West was slamming Russia for its military operation in Chechnya, while NATO was still cleaning up in Kosovo.
So Russia's like, you guys can bomb Serbia to stop ethnic cleansing, but we can't stop terrorists inside our own borders?
That's exactly how they framed it. They felt the West had no moral right to lecture them after bypassing the UN.
It's interesting how they eventually turned that logic back on the West, though, like with Georgia and Crimea later on.
Oh, for sure. They started using the responsibility to protect and the Kosovo precedent to justify their own interventions. It's like they kept a receipt from 1999.
If you can do it, so can we.
That's a dangerous game.
But it wasn't just political. This actually changed how their military thinks, too. They were obsessed with NATO's air war.
Right, I saw that. They call it sixth-generation warfare or something?
Yeah, contactless war. They saw NATO using precision-guided weapons to destroy a country's infrastructure without even putting boots on the ground.
And they realized they were light years behind.
Massively. It sparked this huge modernization drive. Those caliber missile strikes we see now in places like Syria, That's the direct result of the lessons they learned in 1999.
It's wild. So 1999 wasn't just a regional conflict. It was the moment Russia decided the West was an offensive threat.
Exactly. Their national security documents changed right after. They went from saying large-scale aggression is unlikely to saying the West is the primary danger.
It really is a legacy of conflict. You can trace a straight line from those bombs in Belgrade to the tension we're seeing today.
It's a heavy cycle. The perception of being excluded and the fear of humanitarian pretext, it's all still right there in the rhetoric.
Okay, so I was just reading this conclusion by Tracy German, and it basically says 1999 was the year everything changed for Russia's relationship with the West.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the moment that post-Cold War optimism from the early 90s just evaporated because of the Kosovo campaign.
Wait, was it really that sudden? Like one air campaign just flipped the script?
Well, it triggered this huge rise in anti-Western sentiment. Suddenly, Moscow shifted from focusing on internal issues to worrying about strategic encirclement.
Strategic encirclement, so they felt like NATO was literally closing in on them?
Exactly. The material notes that 1999 prompted a renewed focus on external threats. It really marked the beginning of this period of fracture and alienation we're still seeing.
And it's not just talk, right? They actually started pouring money back into the military after ignoring it for most of the 90s.
Yeah, exactly. German calls it military regeneration and modernization. They realized they couldn't afford to be technically inferior anymore.
I mean, it makes sense if you feel threatened. But what about this idea of being competitive? The text mentions that word a lot.
Right? The Russian narrative is obsessed with competition now. They feel they have to be a strong posture player that can actually influence global events.
It's interesting that it mentions nuclear weapons, too. Not just as weapons, but as symbols of power.
Totally. It's about status. If you have the nukes, you're at the big kids table. It's a very 1999 onward mindset.
But they aren't just going it alone, right? I saw China and India mentioned as partners in the East.
Oh, for sure. China is becoming a huge partner because they both share these very strict views on sovereignty and non-intervention.
Wait, so they're basically bonding over their dislike of the U.S. having so much power?
Pretty much. They're looking for a staunchly independent line on foreign policy that doesn't rely on Western approval.
So when we look at how Russia acts today, well, in 2019, according to the text, is that all just the lessons of 1999 playing out?
German says those lessons have been heeded and inculcated in Moscow. Everything we see now is the result of decades of them assessing their own vulnerabilities.
It's wild to think a conflict 20 years ago is still the blueprint for their entire strategy.
It really is. That strategic competition that started in 1999, it never really stopped. It just intensified.
And NATO enlargement is still the big boogeyman in all of this, right?
Always. Continued opposition to NATO's global reach is one of those long-running themes that started right then and there.
It's like they're still fighting the ghost of the Kosovo intervention in every policy meeting.
Honestly, yeah. The year 1999 had a profound impact on how they think about the use of force in the whole international system.
I guess if you feel like the rules were broken once, you never trust the rulemaker again.
Exactly. That's the alienation German is talking about. It shapes everything.
Man, it really puts the current headlines into perspective.
Right. You can't understand where they're going if you don't look back at what happened in '99.
All right, so I was looking into this huge Russian Defense Ministry meeting from late 2021. It's wild how much they covered, from hypersonic missiles to building hospitals for civilians.
Yeah, it was their annual expanded board meeting. It's basically where the top leadership, including Putin and Defense Minister Shoigu, lay out everything they did that year and what's coming next.
The numbers they were throwing around for modernization are kind of staggering. Putin mentioned the share of modern weapons in the troops exceeded 71%. That's a massive overhaul.
It really is. And get this, for the strategic nuclear forces, that number was even higher, at 89%. They're clearly prioritizing the nuclear triad above almost everything else.
Wait, 89%? That's almost the entire fleet. And they talked about those new systems too, right? The ones we always hear about in the news?
Exactly. Putin specifically highlighted the Avangard and Kinjal systems. Those are the ones that have already been put on combat duty. They're basically the face of their new high-tech arsenal.
But it wasn't just about the flashy hardware. A lot of the speech was about the geopolitical tension. Putin seemed really focused on NATO moving closer to their borders.
He was very blunt about it. He talked about how U.S. missile systems in Romania and eventually Poland are a huge challenge for Russian security because of the flight times.
Right, I saw that.
He said if these systems end up in Ukraine, the flight time to Moscow would be like 7 to 10 minutes, or even 5 for hypersonic stuff.
Yeah, that's the nightmare scenario he was painting. He's basically saying that Russia is being forced into a corner where they have to respond with military technical reciprocal measures.
It's interesting, though. He also mentioned that back in the 90s, U.S. specialists were actually at Russian nuclear facilities. Like they had desks and American flags there.
I know, it sounds almost surreal now, doesn't it? He used that to argue that Russia tried to be open and allied, but that the West just kept expanding NATO anyway. He called it euphoria from winning the Cold War.
Moving away from the high-stakes politics for a second, I was surprised by how much they talked about the military's role in the pandemic. I didn't realize they were treating so many civilians.
Oh, it was a massive part of their domestic operations. Military doctors treated over 30,000 patients, and about half of those were regular civilians, not just soldiers.
And they built those multifunctional medical centers too, right? Shoigu mentioned they fulfilled instructions to help 16 different regions with medical staff and oxygen.
They even got the vaccination rate for military personnel to almost 100%. That's how they kept the units ready to go, even when the rest of the country was struggling.
Shoigu's part of the presentation got really technical. He mentioned this Kupol satellite system and new long-enduring drones like the Altius RU.
Yeah, the Inohadets and four-post drones, too. They're trying to close the gap in reconnaissance and strike capabilities. And the Navy isn't being left behind either. They're finishing tests on the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile.
It feels like a total digital transformation. Putin even mentioned putting artificial intelligence into the decision-making systems for commanders.
That's the goal. They want decisions made in minutes or even seconds. But interestingly, Putin also said that despite all the tech, the commander's unconventional decisions are still what wins battles.
So they want AI, but they also want the human touch when things get messy. That's a tough balance to strike.
It really is. And speaking of the people, they spent a lot of time talking about the social guarantees. I was actually shocked at the pay scale for a lieutenant compared to the private sector.
Yeah, Putin said the average for a lieutenant was over 81,000 rubles, while the leading industries like oil and finance were around 63,000. They're really trying to make military service the top career choice.
And the housing, too. They're pouring billions into housing subsidies and mortgages. Shoigu said they finally resolved the chronic problem of permanent housing after years of struggle.
They even mentioned a loyalty program called Russian Army Partners with 30% discounts at stores. It's like a corporate benefits package, but for the military.
It's all part of professionalizing the force. Shoigu noted that the number of contract soldiers is now double the number of conscripts, and most have higher or vocational education.
One thing that caught my eye was the UMCA Arctic expedition. They were testing weapons in high latitudes and low temperatures. That sounds intense.
The Arctic is huge for them. They're renovating airfields and building up infrastructure there like crazy. They want to make sure their tech actually works when it's minus 40 degrees.
And they aren't doing it all alone. Shoigu was very quick to point out their cooperation with China, India, and the SCO, saying it shows the futility of trying to isolate Russia.
Exactly. They even did joint air and marine patrols with China. It's a clear signal to the West that they have partners elsewhere.
It's a lot to take in. It paints a picture of a military that is modernizing at breakneck speed while feeling more and more threatened by NATO's presence.
Right. It's that combination of we are stronger than ever and we are under more pressure than ever. That was really the core message of the whole meeting.
Well, it definitely gives context to everything that's been happening since then. Thanks for breaking this down with me.
Anytime. It's a fascinating, if somewhat intense, look into their strategic thinking.
All right, so I was checking out this report from the Russian Defense Ministry, and man, they are pouring some serious resources into military medicine.
Oh, definitely. They've moved military medicine to what they're calling advanced positions. Like 50 different military medical organizations are now doing telemedicine.
Wait, 1,500 telemedicine services just in 2021? That seems like a massive jump for a military setup.
It is. They're saying it's actually helped drop the overall morbidity rate among the troops. Plus, they opened these high-tech facilities in places like Moscow and Vladikavkaz.
I noticed they mentioned civilians can use some of these facilities too. But what really caught my eye was the Arctic stuff. 2 whole bases on the islands?
Yeah, it's not just the bases. They've got air defense and coastal missiles up there now. They're basically trying to lock down that Arctic border.
And they're renovating 5 airfields just to handle every type of aircraft. That sounds like a logistical nightmare in that weather.
No kidding. They actually delivered over 72,000 tons of cargo to these tiny, hard-to-reach stations before the winter really hit in October.
What's wild to me is the environmental cleanup part. They actually cleared out 28,000 tons of scrap metal from the Arctic?
Right? It's like they're trying to undo years of damage while they're building new stuff. It's a massive cleanup effort.
Okay, let's talk money for a second. The report says for every ruble invested in construction, they're getting 2 rubles worth of assets back. How does that even work?
They claim it's all about standardized projects. They're building things on these crazy tight schedules, 3 or 4 months sometimes, by using the same blueprints over and over.
Efficiency, I guess. And they're even having oil companies pay for refueling complexes at the airfields? That's over 21 billion rubles from the private sector.
Exactly. They're also upgrading their storage. They've built over 600 modern facilities for missiles and ammo now.
Wait, they're even having the railway force rebuild sections of the Baikal-Amur main line? That's a huge civilian rail project.
Yeah, it's 339 kilometers. They're using military units to get it done ahead of schedule. It's definitely a total state approach.
Then there's the Young Army movement. Over 1 million teenagers? That's a lot of kids in uniform.
It's huge. They've got these patriot parks popping up everywhere. And that avant-garde center in Moscow, they've already trained 10,000 young people in basic combat.
They're even setting up a dedicated TV studio to make patriotic films. They're really leaning into the cultural side of things.
Well, the report says 88% of citizens are proud of the army, so they clearly think the messaging is working.
Let's look at the gear. They're adding 21 launchers for Yars, Avangard, and Sarmat missiles next year. That's a serious nuclear upgrade.
And 2 more Tu-160M strategic bombers. Plus, the Navy is getting a new Bore A-class submarine called the Generalissimo Suvorov.
1,000 armored vehicles, 257 aircraft, 5 more submarines. The list for 2022 is basically a shopping spree.
It really is. But the most interesting part of the whole meeting was at the end, when Putin went off script about NATO.
Oh, I saw that. He was bringing up Yugoslavia and Iraq, basically saying the West does whatever it wants without the UN.
Yeah, his point was that when the U.S. acts thousands of miles away, they call it security. But when things happen in Ukraine, it's on Russia's doorstep.
He specifically mentioned hypersonic weapons. He's worried the U.S. will give them to Ukraine once they develop them.
Right. He said they have nowhere further to retreat. He's pushing for these written legal guarantees from Washington and Brussels.
But he sounded skeptical, didn't he? Like he's afraid they'll just drown the proposals in words to buy time.
Totally. He basically said they'll only get those guarantees if the armed forces keep developing at this pace. It's a very peace through strength vibe.
It's a lot to take in. The sheer scale of the construction and the military tech is just intense.
Yeah, it's a massive operation. Definitely sounds like they're not slowing down in 2022.
Well, that's one way to start the new year. Thanks for breaking this down with me.
Anytime. Catch you later.